Good evening, everyone. We continue our study in the book of Job, and we have skipped a number of chapters to chapter 25, and we will continue from chapter 25 all the way to the end. Now, in between that we have left off were a number of discourses of how the friends of Job or Eov had actually suggested over and over again from a very philosophical approach that his friends called Eliphaz, Bildad, Zophar are continuously insisting that somehow Job must have done something really wrong to experience all these problems, suffering, and pain. Every time the friends had advised him philosophically, he would come back with his defense that he keeps insisting that he is innocent. He is suffering for some unknown reason. He thinks that God has left all of the events happening to nature, to the stars, to the creation on what we would call autopilot. And God has no time to look at a person like him. Now, let us all be duly reminded that Job is seen in chapters 1 and 2 as a person who is blameless, who is upright, who fears God and shuns evil. And God looks at him as the prime example. The narratives in chapters 1 and 2 describes Job as somebody who is extremely great and recognized, perhaps extremely rich in that part of the world, the Eastern world. And with that, we need to always remember that Job has a very different view of God than most other people. And his friends, especially, held somewhat similar and yet could not empathize with Job. The views that his friends Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar had were insisting that Job had committed some sin so grievous that God is punishing him for it. In today's short chapter of 6 verses, we now look at Bildad's final discourse. And in this discourse, he is still saying that God is punishing Job for some reason, but now he has come to the point where it may not be explainable and it might not even be good to attempt to explain something like that. From this chapter on, we will then eventually meet the last friend of Job by the name of Elihu. And with Elihu, a very young person who has given all the opportunities to his elders to speak first, comes through in this book of Job as somebody whom God did not rebuke. In fact, God rebuked Eliphaz, Bildad, Zophar, such that we are not here to emulate any of these friends in trying to assist another person from their suffering, and that's not the way to alleviate somebody from their challenges of life. Yet we are seeing an extensive discourse. Now, as we come to the final discourse of Bildad, I would like to say that it is important for us to be very careful not to take words by the friends and build a theology around it. We are also advised to be careful that even Job himself, a righteous man, somebody whom God says is blameless, upright, God-fearing, shuns all evil, and in times of great suffering and pain, he may have said things which is very human after all. He detests the fact that he had ever been born because at this point in time, he is suffering such a great deal that he cannot explain why it happened to him. And it's definitely not because of any sin. Now we get into the final discourse of Bildad, the Shuhite or the Shuhi. In verse 1, we say this, then, and in this case, it is and then, meaning after Job had said his words in chapter 24, then we have Bildad the Shuhi, the Hashuhi right here. That's the place that it comes from. And he said something. This is Vayomer. He actually responded. He answered and he responded. Now, this word responded says this. There are two actions here. He answered, and this means he answered Job, and then he also said things. So there are two verbs that is registered in one single English word. These two verbs are located here. So I'm just trying to show you that in the Hebrew, oftentimes the translator is trying to make things sound very modern. But the Hebrew really gives us a what we call a consecutive imagery. He answered and then he said this. So Bildad the Shuhite was answering Job, and these were the words he said. Verse 2. And it says here, dominion and awe belong to him who makes peace in his heights. Now, oftentimes when translation is done, especially in books like Job, in a more poetic form, it is not so easy to read because it doesn't make much sense to us. So allow me to attempt to explain some of the Hebrew behind these words. Bildad is now coming to the point to say, God will judge and bless the good and punish the wicked. And even with all the insistence that Job says that he's innocent, he has now come to the point where, well, even though Job says he's innocent, God still punished. And maybe this punishment was not specifically directed to Job. So he begins to say dominion. Now, this idea of dominion is the sphere of rule. And we know that God made the world, he has dominion over all things. In Genesis chapter 1, right towards the end, God says to give dominion of the creation of the living things and the world at large to Adam. And so dominion comes from top down. We need to understand the idea of the sphere of rule. The environment that God rules is the entire sphere, right? The entire sphere of creation. And in that rule, as the creator, he can delegate downwards the authority. And so it says here, the sphere of rule, the area where God exercises dominion, which is his entire creation. And the second part here is awe or dread. Now, dread literally means something that is fearful, that you would be terrified of what God can judge. punish. That is what creates awe. Now, this word awe is in the negative form. It's a form of an alarm. It is a form of great terror, great fear. And so Bildad is saying, God has his authority of rule over all creation. And by this, he can judge. And by his judgment, he brings with him awe, fear, terror. This is God. And this, it says here, it is all belonging to him. The word belong to him, well, the word belong doesn't it's not in the Hebrew, right? So let me just strike this out. The actual preposition that is there in the text is this word, emo. It says it's with him or together with him. And I think it's being reasoned by Bildad that everything good and bad is with God in his dominion. So whatever has happened to Job or any part of the world, it is in the sphere of God's control, and that is his expression. And it says that God makes peace, and this word peace here is shalom, in his heights. The word heights here, uh, I think you would see this as in high places. The ancient people always look at God, he looks up to God. They never look down to God, they look up towards God. And in this up, it would be in the heights. So that is what it means. That he makes peace in the high places of God. God is always up there, and he's always having his complete control. So this word peace doesn't literally means peace in that sense, but he is overall in his dominion up there. And so it is fine to say that God is up there in his dominion. And it is somewhat consistent with what Job is saying. Job is saying, well, God is just up there. He's got no time for people like me. Because he's trying to explain and rationalize why he is suffering. Why did he lose everything? Why is he in pain when he himself is blameless? He still is blameless in his lips. Why is he suffering when he is upright? He is God fearing. He is shunning all evil. And Bildad is saying, well, even if you say that it is resigned to nature and the stars, well, up there, God is still in control in that sense. So he is having his dominion over all of creation, and you happen to be just there. And Bildad is now suggesting this, that don't you know this is this of God? Now, we are not here to develop a doctrine about God's character, but in this case, Bildad is trying to position everything about God in this world, and it appears that they have discounted the aspect of free will. They are all saying that everything is what God is doing. There's nothing you can do about it. So if you are suffering, it's because you have done something wrong. And even if you insist that you are um, innocent, well, you are still suffering. So it must have been evident that God is punishing somewhere, and maybe you got caught in the crossfire. And so he describes about God, is there any number to his troops. Now, this idea here is, uh, I guess, this is to express the quantity, right? This is the quantity in the sphere of God. Can you actually number his? Well, this one says his troops. You could actually say that this is his troops, his army, or his servants. Now, in the old days, you find that the servants of the master are the ones who will go and fight the war. Abraham found 300 of his able men to go and rescue Lot. When you read that in the book of Genesis, you have also heard that God's name uh, is the Lord of hosts, right? Lord of hosts. Uh, and that really means that God is seen, and Bildad knows this well, that he has his legions of army, his angels. The angels of God is seen as the hosts of God, the army of God, and the servants of God. Can you actually number them? And we are told that there is innumerable. And Bildad is trying to rebuke Job. Says, while you say all these things, that God seems not to have cared about you, yeah, but he has punished you. But what has that got to do with the fact that God is so awesome? God is way up there. Who are you to question him? And so now in verse 3, the second part is, and upon whom does his light not rise? What does this mean? His sun shines everywhere, right? His sun shines everywhere, on the good and on the bad, on the evil. And the argument that Bildad is trying to express is this: perhaps when you are seeing God blessing the world as giving sunshine, well, the good and the bad receives it. And now that you have been receiving pain, perhaps God is punishing and you happen to be in the crossfire. And God cannot say he will stop punishing others and he doesn't punish you. Now, if you think of it this way, God's punishment is in a way true and in a way not true. For example, when God punishes Israel and he brings the armies of the enemies like the Syrians and the Babylonians, and it come to raid the nation, the land, the cities, and conquer the land. First, the northern kingdom by the Assyrians. Um, the good, the innocent will also be part and parcel of the spoils of war. And so, in that sense, when God allows something to happen, it will affect both the good and bad. And that's what he means here, right? He means that, well, when God shines, he shines on everybody. He doesn't say, I'm going to just shine on the good and all the bad is not going to have light. And so it also goes to show that when God punishes, the good will also get caught in it. And that would be Bildad's argument to Job at this point in time, suggesting to Job that his situation is because God is punishing a lot of people and he happened to be in the crossfire. But we have read since in chapters 1 and 2 that is not the case at all. God wasn't punishing the entire place. God is seen to be addressing solely Job. Whatever has happened is happened to Job's family, his property, his wealth, himself, his health, and he's in pain. And so, what Bildad is saying doesn't make sense at all. And so even though he is extolling God and lifting up the dominion of God, he is not making sense to Job because that is not what God is doing. Notice in the entire book, the friends are trying to help Job rationalize why all these strange but spectacular phenomena actually occurred to the most famous man, the wisest man, the most God-fearing man, the most blameless man. Something has gone wrong. And that's what is happening in the mind of his friends, Eliphaz, Bildad, Zophar, and now finally Bildad's last discourse. He is no longer insisting that Job has sinned or Job has sinned greatly. He is saying that, well, God has shone his light and everybody gets it. So maybe God has punished the people and he is part of the scheme of punishment. And again, if you were Job, you would answer what he will say in chapter 26. And so from 26 onwards, you would hear of Job's defense one more time. We come to verse 4. Remember, Bildad's argument is no longer specifically pointing out Job's grievous sins. He is suggesting that it is not because things have been left to nature or the stars and God has just stepped back. Bildad is saying it is in God's control. The whole dominion is his, the good and the bad, the blessings and the curses. The punishment comes down and it does not avoid the good. That would be in verse 3. Now in verse 4, Bildad now rebukes Job. He says, how then can mankind be righteous with God? Now, this word enosh is not mankind. It would be easier to translate as mortal man. This Job, you are a mortal man. How can man be just? Just means to have a just cause. To be just in what would you say in arguing against God. And that would be this meaning in this context. Because Job insists he is innocent. He has not sinned. And he says, I don't understand. Maybe God has just left everything to the stars. God is not paying attention to me. And Bildad is trying to rebuke Job. How can a mortal man like you, Job, say anything against God? Right? God here would be El. Or how can anyone who is born of a woman be pure? So let me just explain this. It says born of a woman literally is an expression, right? Born of a woman is a mortal man. And so this is an A and a B, meaning these are two statements that is saying the same thing, but is giving us an emphasis. So let us look at this word pure. Pure here means be clean, uh, be innocent. And that would be an aspect for us to think about. So this word pure and righteous are both synonyms in this verse. It is trying to tell us that how can a mortal man be right with God in asking God to explain? How can a mortal man even have the idea that he has never done anything wrong? See, notice all of these are what we call philosophical statements. And what does philosophical statements mean? They are broad statements that encompasses general themes, general ideas. It cannot really be wrong unless you look at the details. And how does it help Job? How what do you mean that a man cannot ask God to explain? You mean man is so small that man has no right? That would be the contrast of what's going on in Job's mind. And so what Bildad is trying to say in these last few verses, last three verses, are all what we call philosophical statements to say that Job has no right to ask God to explain anything. So it says, and even if the moon has no brightness, the idea of no brightness, that it means that is not clear, it is not shining, not shining. Uh, Basically, there is no light, no light, and in our terms, it's covered by the moon. So it's covered by the clouds. Even the moon is not shining. Uh, God can God can do that, right? You can look at the moon, and God can cause the moon not to be bright. You can look at the stars, because there is a word here, behold. It is missing here, right? Behold. It says, look, and if the stars are not pure, now in this same word, pure is clean or shining, right? Or shining. And so again, this word pure and this word brightness are also expressing light, luminescent, right? Luminous. It is radiant. That is what it means. And God can block out all these as well. And even then, it is not pure, not shining in his eyes. What does that really mean is this? When the moon shines and when the stars shine, they can be looked at that it is not perfect. It cannot be uh, as bright as what God wants. It cannot be as shining as what God wants. And that would be a way of really looking at these verses to tell Job that, well, don't try to say anything. You're just a mortal man. Whatever you say will not be enough, because God is far greater than your little complaints, your little puny defense. That would be how Bildad is now expressing. Verse 6, and he concludes verse 6 by saying, how much less is man? Now it would be uh the word here, how much less is man? And in this case, man would be mortal man, right? Mortal man. How much less is mortal man? And then we don't have this word that. And then I would suggest it would be like a maggot. right? Like a maggot. The idea of maggot here is a worm. It is a worm. And then the second line is again an A and a B. It is expressing two statements with the same idea. A son of man or son of a man. And this one would be son of Adam, of mankind. Like a, well, this is the second time we have this word. This one would be a worm. Uh, Maybe you could use it as a maggot or uh, a scarlet worm, but both are worms, right? And what is the idea here is this: a mortal man is equivalent to a worm? Not exactly. The expression is not saying that the mortal man is like a worm, but it's in the idea, in the fact that they are subjected to the worm. Now, this one, let me explain. They are subjected to the worm because when a mortal man dies, he is food for the worm. So, a, a mortal man, and Enosh, a son of man, Ben Adam, they are all mortal, they die, and when they die, the worm will have his feast on man. And so, if that is the case, Joe, that you too will go into the ground to be food for the worm, not that you're going to be worm. So literally what happens is that when a man dies and is buried, uh the worms will start appearing, and worms will be feeding on the body. And the imagery is that man has become worms or food for worms. That would be the expression in verse 6. And again, a rebuke to Job. You are like going to be food for worm. How can you talk to God this way? Even the moon in its all grandeur cannot say that. Even the stars is not perfect in his sight. How much more is man? How can you have a just complaint towards God? So this is Bildad's argument, trying to shut Job up, saying that whatever has happened is like God shining the sun upon this land, that the good and bad will get it. And so your predicament is what God has done for many others, and you are just part of it. But that is not true. And so we will see tomorrow how Job defends himself and begins to show his true ideas of how he views God. Why God says that he is blameless, upright, God fearing, and shuns evil. Why would Job be such a man, so interesting in God's eyes, that God is so confident that Job knows God more than his friends? Now, his friends are the ones that came to console him and yet was trying to rebuke Job, trying to tell Job that he has done all kinds of wrong. And we've spent a number of weeks going through that. And we will leave the three friends, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar, and we will encounter Elihu in the chapters to come. And from tomorrow, we will be actually examining the mind of Job, how Job views God. Is Bildad's view of God wrong? Well, in this case, he has applied it wrongly upon Job. God has dominion over the world, but God is not punishing the world and Job got punished along the way. It is also not true. Can man ask God? Well, we will see tomorrow. Is Bildad right that man has no right to request of God? Then the question we need to ask ourselves and bear in mind as we enter into chapter 26 is that it is not just mortal man. It is a man that God has so looked upon to say that he is blameless, he is upright, he is God fearing, he knows God and his punishment, so he is very fearful of God, and he shuns all evil so that he pleases God in his life with what he has, with his words, his family, and the community at large. And so it is not the question, can mortal man ask God? The question should be, can a God fearing man, can a man who is blameless, who is upright, who shuns all evil, ask God for an answer? That should be the better question. And so we now end all the discussions of Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar just for our own general knowledge that they have approached this at a very high level, talking about a high level concept of God, and then trying to point out that Job has truly sinned, and yet he refuses to admit it. And over again, Job insists that he is blameless, and nothing that the friends have said has actually shown a shred of evidence that he has actually sinned. And so finally, we come to chapter 25, and Bildad basically tells Job, please shut up. You are just a mortal man, and you're going into the ground one day, and the worms will eat you up. So shut up. And we will see what happens tomorrow in chapter 26. And with this, we come to the end of our session today.